Hello gamers, Powered Heal here, and today we have a Priest rating specialization video for WoW Classic 2024, and what we're going to do is we're basically going to be breaking down all the specializations. I'm going to be showing you how to build them out, I'm going to be showing you variations of them, and then I'm going to be kind of explaining what they're used for. We'll pretty much start actually each one with announcing kind of like the name of it, and then what it's going to be used for, and then we'll go and build it out. Right, so we'll keep this pretty quick because there's no reason to ramble on, and we'll get right into it. So, starting with the first spec, it's going to be the Power Infusion spec. So it's basically coming down to 31 points in Discipline. And what is the Power Infusion spec? Why are we using it, right? So it's basically a spec to buff your casters. Doesn't really do much for you personally, this spec. But it does help your casters out a little bit. It's sort of considered like the default spec, and the reason why it tends to be considered the default spec is because obviously the game is very easy, so people's thought process is like, well, you don't really need to invest into Holy, right, to get spiritual guidance to play the game, so therefore why not just, power up your casters, make them do a bit more damage, and get the runs done faster. That's kind of like the thought process. The reality of the situation, though, is that this isn't really like that strong for like speed clearing in general. It's more of like a parsing spec to help your casters parse, because you have a raid. Let's say you're running it in like 30 minutes to 45 minutes, right? And we'll say like 30 to 50 minutes for probably most groups. That's like the range a lot of decent groups are going to run in at this point. And your mage is getting, what is this? I think it's every 2 or 3 minutes this pops up, right? So your mage is getting 20% extra damage for 15 seconds every 2 or 3 minutes is not really that significant, especially because most of the trash in the raid, like most of the time in the raid is spent killing trash, and most of the trash is like trash that's not being AoE'd necessarily, but it's being cleaved. And mages can't really cleave at all. They're going to be single targeting down trash like that. So their damage uptime on those trash packs is, they just don't do a ton of damage relative to some of the other classes in the game. And, it's mostly used on bosses because a boss fight might last like 30 seconds, right? It could even last 18 seconds. It could last 40 seconds. So obviously having 15 seconds of 20% more damage is pretty significant in terms of parsing on that boss in particular, right? But it's not very significant in terms of like the overall speed of the run. This is kind of like the default speedrunning spec. Personally, I think that's a bit of a mistake. I think that the optimal way to play speedrunning would be you would try and drop even more healers, and you'd heavily lean into spiritual guidance to, and then you would play off your like longer casts, more efficient heals, right? You really play into spiritual guidance. The reality is, though, that most people don't want to take the risk of playing like that. So even speedruns tend to be a bit overhealed to some degree, because the thought process is like, it's better to just bring an extra healer or something like that and have the run go like 90% smoother than not bring an extra healer and be really playing on the margins, because although you'll do more damage with one extra DPS, you really have to kind of like play properly, and you can't really have as many mistakes, right, if you have less healers in the raid and they're actually trying to play efficiently and playing around their mana, stuff like that. So the default option just tends to be to go PI spec for speedrunning even, because it makes the mage do a little bit more damage. And because of the playstyle of the class, it doesn't really change that much from going the Holy Spec. And I'll kind of explain that now. So if you're in a guild that kind of, has a lot of overhealing essentially, right, and you have quick kill times, what tends to happen is you're using a ton of flash heal, right? Using a ton of flash heal, you're using a ton of shield, stuff like that. You're just trying to save people. Essentially, like, you're casting heals to make sure people don't die, right? Because somebody dies, it's a big time saver, because rezzing them costs a lot, rebuffing them costs a lot, just the time spent getting them up kind of costs a lot. It's like a whole opportunity cost thing. So you're just playing to make sure that people don't die. And when you're playing in that sort of mode on Priest, you don't lose a ton really by not having Spiritual Guidance, because you're gaining more healing power, yes, by having Spiritual Guidance, but it's basically getting halved for your flash heals, and you're only getting like 10% of it for your shields and stuff like that. So there's not like a ton of situations where this is like super effective. So I think a lot of people just say, well, we'll just bite the bullet and we'll just go Power Infusion, right? And we'll give our casters a bit more damage, and that'll be that, because you're not really losing much from there. So yeah, if you're in a guild that kind of just has like way too much healing for its own good, and you're kind of like way too much damage, you're speed clearing and stuff like that, it's not like a terrible spec to play, you know what I mean? Especially if you don't mind buffing your casters or whatever. This is probably a spec that I should have been playing on my main for like our first 2 weeks when we were doing a whole run, because our damage was just so high, and our damage was just so high. We had so much healing. It was crazy. But now we're doing split run, so I'm going to go back to playing the Holy Hybrid spec, which I'll talk about later. But how do we build the spec out, right? So for me, when I'm doing rating specs, I have a Shadow off spec, so I don't care about damage at all in my rating spec. I just swap to the Shadow off spec if I'm farming something or doing something like that, right? So if you're trying to make the spec work as like, you can kill stuff out in the world and raid on it, you take 5 out of 5 wand specialization instead of this. It's not really a huge deal breaker to not have Unbreakable Will. But if you're just trying to like min-max completely for raid, obviously Unbreakable Will is better. So you just 5 points in there. These are mandatory right here. These 5 points, these are mandatory. Then I normally put 1 point in Silent Resolve over Martyrdom. Reason is because like you're just not getting a lot of use cases for Martyrdom. And I'll talk about Silent Resolve a little bit later when we get down the end of the tree. So 5 out of 5 mental agility, and then a point in Divine Spirit. You put 5 points into mental strength. And then here's another decision where basically if you're using this as a damage, to be able to kill stuff in the world and raid, then you'll put 4 points into Force of Will right here, right, to unlock Power Infusion, to give you a bit more spell damage, a bit more offensive crit. But what I do typically is I put the points into Silent Resolve, because like I said, I have a Shadow spec if I want to go around and kill stuff. And the reason why I put points in Silent Resolve over anything else is because threat in raids still can be a little bit of a temperamental and annoying thing sometimes, especially if you're kind of pushing fast. A couple examples would be a fight like Gar, where things sometimes get banished, right? Or they're maybe being off-tanked, and the off-tank is not really dumping a lot into them, right? And it can be easy to rip off, especially early on in the fight. It can even be a situation where if you have to like clutch heal the main tank off the rip on Gar, you can generate a lot of threat there from some of the other ads if they're not picked up properly. There's also situations where you can be like fighting Trash and MC. Something can kind of link onto the Trash, like a Lava Surger or something. Tanks may not notice it immediately, and it just kind of like you drop a big heal on somebody and it just kind of paths your way, right? And if somebody doesn't immediately run into it and turn it around, then it can be a big problem. So I tend to just prefer putting points in here to completely, mitigate any threat issues. Also, if this is doubling as your dungeon healing spec, which it does, it will for most people, because most people are going to run just a Shadow off spec like me to kill things when you're not raiding, obviously, right? So this is like super useful in dungeons, right? Because the quality of your tank is unknown. It's very often warriors struggle to get threat on multiple mobs, right? And you're pulling multiple mobs a lot. People aggro unexpected stuff all the time, and then you're healing, it goes right onto you because of the heal aggro, right? So this is an incredibly useful 5 points to have for dungeons in particular. And it's still somewhat helpful in raid. It's more helpful than pretty much anything else you're going to have, because you're not going to be wanding stuff really. You're not going to use Martyrdom. You're not going to be mana burning anything except in AQ, but it's not really a big deal. You're not going... The only other points I would say... The only thing you would put points in here is really improved Inner Fire. But how I do my armor is I have Inner Fire going as well as a armor potion. So my armor potion gives me around the same that improved inner fire would give. And you would be like, well, yeah, but you could have both, right? And it's like, you could have both, but with just the armor potion, you're already kind of entering the territory where you're starting to get pretty heavy DR on armor. So that means that, the extra 300 or so armor you're getting from improved inner fire here, a little bit more than that, but it's around that. It just isn't going to be really that helpful. It might be like 1 or 2% more mitigation, right? So that's why I just opt to go for the threat reduction, and with the idea being I don't get threat to begin with, so I don't need the armor at all, right? And that's basically how I do this part of the tree. And then you would put a point into power infusion. Then you come in here. I always take healing focus, especially since this is going to be my raid and dungeon spec, but it can still be useful in a raid. I've definitely had situations where I've had a Gar ad beating on me for a couple minutes, you know what I mean? And the reality is like the crit here, 5%, even if you were to max this out, 5% crit, it's not make or break for you as a priest during raiding or dungeoning for that matter, right? It's just not. And I would much rather have this, especially if I'm going to be doing any dungeons at all. This is like way more useful than anything else you can have. So I just put 2 out of 2 in healing focus. Then I put 3 out of 3 in improve renew. This is something where you absolutely could put the points into holy spec instead if you wanted. I like having renew kind of as a just in case scenario, and my guild is doing split runs, right? So because my guild is doing split runs, that means that each run is going to be relatively weaker than if we were to just do one main run, obviously, right? Because we're using alt, social, stuff like that. So that means there's more opportunities to sneak some renew in and get some value out of renew. If you're in a guild, like I said, that they just do one run, they clear it anywhere from 30 to 50 minutes, it's a fast, smooth run, a lot of overhealing, stuff like that, you might literally never get a chance to really get like any value out of renew. And if that's the case, then you can put the points in holy specialization if you want like pure raid optimization. The one thing I will say about improve renew too, though, is that obviously this is really good for dungeon healing because renew is great in dungeons. So I just tend to put the 3 points in renew, and then I put the 5 points in here. And I put 3 out of 3 inspiration. That's pretty standard. I opt to not go Holy Nova because, again, I just don't care about doing any offense on this build. It's going to be a pure raid build. If I were trying to do something like farm DM Lashers or something, you could put, or maybe do the ZF farm. Obviously, you could get Holy Nova here, but I just don't care about that. So I just start putting points in here. And then we put 3 out of 3 in this, obviously, and then you have 2 points left, and you can either put them, I would say, in Holy Reach, right, or in Holy Specialization for the crit. So it's completely up to you. It kind of depends on how often you think you're getting value out of Prayer of Healing. If you get put in melee groups, it tends to be more worth it. If you're not, then it's hard to get value out of it. Your Prayer of Healing range is pretty good already, to be honest, so, do you really need this a ton? Probably not, but it can be helpful in some cases because you are a bit more likely to be spread out in a raid. You're usually not like right up on your warriors, right? So how I would play this is I typically would put 2 points in Holy Reach, just because if you're comparing like the idea of somebody potentially getting hit by your Prayer of Healing or not versus just 2% extra spell crit for a healer, I would much rather take the chance that, having a little bit of extra range might actually help in some circumstances and get somebody healed that it otherwise wouldn't, right? So I just view that as more impactful in any given situation than 2% spell crit, right? But you can kind of just do what you want with the points. So you can put the points in there or in there, right? It doesn't matter either way. But this is what I would do for PI spec, essentially. Those are basically all the variations and all the reasons why you might want to go PI spec. So what's the other spec, right? So there's kind of like 2 other specs, but they're basically like the same. They just switch some talents around at the end, so we're going to basically call them Holy Disc Hybrid, right? And how do you build? Well, first we'll talk about like where do you use these. So these are great in dungeons, right, in particular, because having more healing power in dungeons is just a straight power boost because you're the only one healing, so you can control all the parameters and you can make sure you're squeezing every little ounce out of the additional healing power you have, right? Like having your renew have a couple more hundred healing in a dungeon is like really nice over the course of an entire dungeon and doing many dungeons. And making it so your rank 4 heal is way more reliable, as it's like a solid workhorse heal that you always cast in dungeons is really great. So yeah, I'd say this build really stands out in dungeons, but it's also good in any type of raiding environment that's kind of not like super speedrun orientated, right? Like anything where you may have to sometimes cast your most efficient heals is really strong. Like this was a great build in Season of Mastery, for example, in my opinion, because some of the fights, especially early on, like very, very early MC, were actually somewhat challenging in terms of being able to manage your mana if you weren't like cheesing them with mana flasks or something like that. So having extra healing there was really huge. And this is going to be like if you're in kind of like a dad guild, I guess, like not to use that as like a pejorative or anything, but you know what I mean, like just a guild that's like kind of casual, right? There's going to be a lot of opportunity to potentially use things like renew or things like heal rank 4, stuff like that. Anything that's going to be a bit more efficient, you can work some greater heals in there, right? And how do we build it out, right? So we'll go 2i2 healing focus. Again, the same thing I just said for the disc spec applies here in terms of the starter holy talents, right? You can choose to take renew or not, but I feel like in this particular case, if you're going this spec to begin with, it's kind of like you're probably saying you expect to potentially get some use out of renew. So if that's the case, you might as well put points in it. That's kind of how I feel, right? So you put 5 out of 5 in Divine Fury. Again, you go Inspiration, and then we start putting points in here. Okay, then we put points in here, and then you can put points in here, and then you go Spiritual Guidance, right? And then we start working on the disc side of things. So we put points in here. Again, the same thing applies. You can take wand spec if you want. Fill this stuff out. This is a situation where this is like one case where I may put a point in Martyrdom, because at this point, Martyrdom may actually become more useful since you're not 5 out of 5ing this and you only get like 4%. So you can kind of do what you want here. But maybe I'll put a point in there, and then I'll put 5 points in Mental Agility and 1 point in Divine Spirit. And typically all of your rating specs as Priest are going to have Divine Spirit in them. You don't necessarily need it if other people have it, but other people are kind of going to be annoyed at you for not taking it because it's like 1 point, and now they have to buff another group. So you pretty much just want to take this, like always if you're rating. And then you basically have a choice here, right? You have 5 extra points, and the typical choices are, you go Mental Strength 5 out of 5, or you go Spiritual Healing 5 out of 5. And in my opinion, Mental Strength tends to be the better option. The problem with using Spiritual Healing is that this only impacts the base healing of the spell. So this doesn't scale with your plus healing. Like any value you're adding with the plus healing, this doesn't multiply. It's just the base amount of the spell. So it's not quite as good as it seems, where this is just giving you 10% mana overall. And the mana that you're spending, obviously, to cast the spells, those spells obviously do all benefit from your plus healing, right? So that's typically why people go Mental Strength. And also on Alliance side, there's things like Kings that are also giving you more mana. This is multiplying, right? So, yeah, people just tend to go Mental Strength here, and I'm one of them. You also if you use a Flask, right? Just another reason to go Mental Strength. But, like it's not griefing to go this. I just think it's kind of like almost strictly worse in most cases. The interesting thing here that was brought up to me recently is Spirit of Redemption. I was talking to like one of the people who frequents my chat, and they were like, do you take Spirit of Redemption in your Holy Spec? I'm like, no, not really. And then I just kind of started thinking about it, and I was like, you know, it's probably, if you're going to spec anyway, it might not be trolling to take this, right? Because it's 1 point, and I think I would put it like this, right? If you are in like a guild that wiping is not super uncommon, right? That in general play is just very sloppy, right? Um, then I think putting a point in this is not really the worst thing in the world, because there's definitely been times where like people have mispulled on a lava pack. For example, like somebody's pulled threat on one of the lava reavers. It turns around, it starts a chain stun that kills me, and I die. And if I would have had Spirit of Redemption, I think I could have saved a couple more people in the raid, right? And this happens, keep in mind, even in like a top guild. Like my guild's a pretty good guild overall. A lot of times that mistake doesn't happen, right? A lot of times, like, I'm not even in that spot to die. Um, but yeah, if you're playing in kind of like a guild where things are more lax, things are sloppy, a lot more mistakes are happening, I could totally see this actually adding some sort of value in terms of preserving the world buffs of other raiders, right? I guess one counterpoint to that is like, if you're in a casual guild to begin with, how many people are caring about getting world buffs and stuff, but I think it's actually not a terrible idea to put 1 point in this, because it's only 1 point, right? So you basically just, you go 4 out of 5 here, and you put 1 point in here, and yeah, I think it just depends. Obviously, if you're in a really good guild, kind of like my guild, you basically like never wipe, people are never dying, then maybe it's not that good of a spell, right? But if you're just play this one by ear, I would say, and adjust it to, like, don't be ashamed to take this because people make fun of you or whatever. Like, it doesn't matter. Like, if your guild is playing sloppy and it's getting people in your raid killed, this could definitely be worth the investment. Now, the other thing over here is Prayer of Healing. This, I think if your alliance tends to be quite good, you tend to be using this more, right? So you go like 3 points in that, 2 points in that, or you could go 2 points, 1 point, 2 points, or you can put the extra 2 points in spiritual healing, whatever you want to do. But as a horde player, I just don't use Prayer of Healing that often in most cases. It's just not something that like I'm really afforded the luxury of being able to do. So I tend not to take this. But if you're going to be in a melee group, and it looks like you're going to be able to use it, then feel free to spec into it. Everything is like kind of situational, and you have to be kind of looking at your own play, thinking of like, okay, was I able to get a lot of prayer healings off last raid? If so, maybe it's worth it to take improved prayer healing. You know what I mean? Because it's definitely worth it to take if you make use of it. It's just, are you going to make use of it? That's like the real question. Okay. And yeah, that's basically the priest rating specs. Like I said, the main differential was, it's like, do we put points in mental strength or do we put points in spiritual healing, right? Now, people are going to ask about Lightwell. My thing with Lightwell is that there are certain situations where Lightwell is kind of decent. The main problem with Lightwell is the cooldown. The cooldown is like atrocious. I believe it's like 15 minutes or something. And it doesn't have a ton of charges. However, I believe all they have to do is click on it, and it's not like a channel, and it's like a hot over them, which is pretty useful unless they're taking like incidental damage. So for example, like if they're on a lava pack, okay, and you have the Lightwell down, and somebody clicks it, and then they're having to attack like the fire elemental, I'm pretty sure those elementals just do radial damage around them. Or like anything that does kind of like radial damage around them or has cleave, it's not going to be so great on, right? But there can be situations in this game, there's like some Nax fights, for example, where something like Lightwell isn't atrocious. It's just a matter of like, do you want to go that deep to get it? And to be honest, it's not really that deep when you think about it, because you can just go like, wait, why do we have 30 points? Oh, you have to put a point in Spirit of Redemption, okay. Yeah, so you could just do something like this, right? Hold on. But then you have to give up, you can't be 21 in here to get Divine Spirit, right? So, again, a lot of people are just going to be like, well, you're kind of trolling because you don't have Divine Spirit, and I have to buff another group now. And the real problem with this spell, in my opinion, is just that even in the situations where it does have use, people aren't going to use it, I feel like, because they're just not used to using it. They think it's a meme. They don't, they don't care about it. And that's a big problem, right? If somebody's just not going to use something that you put down, then it basically has zero value. So I would stay away from this. And yeah, I mean, like, you can experiment with it if you want, but I think your results, unless you have like a super agreeable group of people that are, going to take advantage of it on the specific fights where it does do well, which in my opinion are kind of few and far between, then there's just almost no point to taking it whatsoever. So there's no point to try and get at it, basically. So, yeah, that's how I feel. I would not go 100% deep holy. This is something I hope they fix in like a classic plus or something. I think if they reduced even the cooldown of it to like 5 minutes or something, it actually becomes a lot more interesting, at least, right? But it being on 15 minutes, it's just, I don't know. Even when you can use it, the uptime of it is pretty bad and stuff like that. So, yeah, that's basically holy rating specs, though. So I hope you guys liked that video. If you have any questions, comments, or anything like that, please feel free to leave them in the description. And yeah, like, comment, subscribe if you enjoyed this. Thanks for all the support, and I will talk to you guys later.